All right.
So do I need to stand somewhere that's proximity?
If you don't mind, we will stand switch spots with Jeff. The reason for that is the see how you're more visible. If we move you into the light, you become. It takes over the. See how you get there.
Okay. All right.
So we'll.
Okay. So I can. You just want me to kind of stand in this general.
Because you'll be down.
I'm really bad at like staying in one place. So
it's, people can hear you, and I think the slides will be on the
they'll automatically advance.
Mm-hmm.
You have to change
that
it.
clicker is right there. Yeah.
Okay.
You can have that. But you want to
And this is here to keep you from tripping. So
okay, good.
More
Good.
visible.
Let's think about that then.
It seemed like it was. It's possible it just hasn't completely downloaded yet. It's thinking about something. If it doesn't work, it's okay because I'm not too far.
Oh yeah, you could just.
That's weird because it was working. It was advancing before we.
Yeah, usually.
Okay. So maybe. Yeah, now try it. There we go.
Or something was frozen or something. Okay.
Well,
Yeah, we have another. Yeah, you can take it. I suppose I can stand here while I'm introducing.
yeah, and then I'll jump onto the screen. I think it's just my mom's the only person watching online.
Oh, that's not true. We could.
Stefan said he was going to watch too.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Hey.
It's the W4190 members who are delinquent here. They
Well,
were here.
Garth came for a moment.
Yeah.
Nico's here somewhere.
Nico's here. I think Mark and Tracy, Lucy are here.
If you want to, I mean, if you need to get started, and then I can. I don't care if they come in late. It doesn't bother me.
We have a little bit of tolerance with the
Yeah, and I'm shooting to talk between 35 and 40. Is that?
Yeah. That's perfect. We have an hour out.
Yeah.
It's a 50-minute class. So and then as soon as you get done, there will be some refreshments outside.
Okay.
And that's what we'll set up right now. So.
All right. Very good. Thanks, Tracy.
Tracy.
I just ate a lot of pumpkin spice M&Ms. So.
Is that what they have up there, or did you find?
No, they were. I think they're here. So I guess they stayed back
when
in the
you were
meeting with the students there. That was the refreshment of choice. Actually, I'm going to pour a glass of this water. I tried to drink out of my bottle and I actually drank up.
Oh yeah, I should have thought of getting you.
No, that's fine.
Somehow we are like 2 classes behind. So after I guess we are doing. One friend did for that class. And she's like, oh yeah, and then one of the professors was like, we're gonna have a guest speaker online.
What class was that?
Sharing generation. Oh, that's your substitute for it is. I don't know what's that name. And Chris used to do that.
So that's how they handle it.
Yeah. Wait, is it just you and like 3 other people then? Or well,
Hey,
all
right.
WRS anyway. Okay, but there's confusion. That's the one, yeah. I did watch video and I was clicking to see if I can find you. Your arm was in the yeah, it's like yeah.
All right, great. Do you, I guess the little video screen is up there, which is fine.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I guess that is. Maybe we can.
Doesn't bother me.
Where would be the place I can get it like, that's more or less out of the way.
Is it, do you just have to, it's kind of a cool system. I haven't seen this before. You just hit go or?
Yeah, I don't know if, I'll try to move this stuff off to the side. I'm not sure if the folks viewing online, if that is their video feed for you.
Yeah, because are they able to see the screen as well or no?
Yeah, I'm thinking what they,
screen.
right, I'm thinking they are seeing exactly what we're seeing.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, I think so.
I gotcha. Okay, all right.
So I'll try to move this. If this gets in the way, we can move it.
Like I said, I don't have, I mean, there's not like, you know, crazy animations or anything that are going to happen, so I don't think it matters.
Well, okay, everybody, welcome. I think we'll go ahead and get started. I see it's a minute or two past 3 o'clock. I think everybody's here, including some visitors from afar, so that's wonderful. Welcome to our Headwaters lecture, I guess the first of this academic year. For those of you who are here at our this event for the first time, the purpose of the Headwaters lectures is to bring internationally known researchers in water science and research here to interact with our campus community, including students. So today we're very excited to welcome Dr. Jordan Suter, who's an associate professor in the Department of Agricultural Resource Economics at Colorado State University. Before he was at Colorado State, Jordan was a faculty member at Oberlin College in the economics department, right? And taught there for a number of years. And previous to that, he did his graduate work, master's and PhD at Cornell University. That's a bit of background we have in common, actually, although Jordan's much younger than me. He was there much later. Jordan has made a name for himself and earned a reputation in a couple of areas of work that's relevant to water science and interdisciplinary water science especially. First, he has been working in this area of behavioral and experimental economics, which is a little bit of a departure from the way empirical analysis was done traditionally in economics. It was always working with observational data. You just observe what's going on and try to work with that. Observe what's going on in the economy, basically. In behavioral or especially experimental economics, what you do is construct experimental environments and manipulate the parameters of that. So you change the context and the incentive structures, have people in those environments behave in various ways, observe their behavior and analyze the data. And then you can use that to inform various types of designs of public policies and programs and different types of interventions. Jordan has done a lot of well-known work in that area and has applied it to a lot of water issues, including non-point source pollution and water resource extraction, and most recently groundwater, which I think is what you're going to talk about today. And then another area he's been working in is integrating economic models with biophysical models, including hydrologic and I think crop science models, which is also relevant to the kind of work that we all do and are interested in, I think. So with that, welcome, Jordan. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Jeff, for the nice introduction, and thanks to all of you for being here on a Friday afternoon. I'm really excited to be here and to be able to present this lecture. And I'll start just by acknowledging my great collaborators on this research, Mani Ruirad, Dale Manning, and Chris Gomans, who are colleagues of mine in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics at CSU, Karina Schoengold at the University of Nebraska, and then Zaichen Zhang and Ryan Bailey, who are engineers at CSU. The work that I'm going to talk about today is largely funded through a cooperative agricultural agreement through USDA NEFA. We have an actual nice web page for our work at ogallalawater.org, so I'll invite you to visit that if you have a chance. And although I'll be talking about research in the Ogallala Aquifer, I think that issues related to groundwater management, groundwater conservation are of worldwide importance. So groundwater currently makes up about half of all drinking water sources, nearly half of all irrigation sources, and that amount has increased rather drastically over the last 50 years and is projected to increase further, at least pressure on groundwater resources due to growing populations and changes in surface water supplies due to climate change. So as we think about management, there are some particular challenges that come about because of the common pool nature of groundwater, because the fact that using water at one point imposes a cost on that individual user, but also imposes a cost on others that they don't necessarily take into account when they make their decisions, which suggests that coordinated management is particularly important in this context. So I'm going to talk about what I think economics has, what role economics has to play in this conversation. And I think that economists are not always great at vocalizing what it is that we do and what we can contribute to these conversations. And so hopefully I can identify the areas that I think economists should be playing a role, can play a role, and describe that in the context of a particular groundwater conservation program in the Ogallala Aquifer region. So the first area that I think is really important, but often overlooked by non-economists, is the fact that economics is a behavioral discipline. We want to understand how individuals respond to incentives, and ultimately when we're thinking about policy, how does that policy alter the incentives that those individuals face, and how do they change their behavior? Once we have a handle on changes in behavior, then we can think about measuring the benefits and costs associated with a particular policy and how that filters through the decision-making process. So as I said, I'm going to talk about a particular program. I'm going to try to weave together 4 separate papers that we're working on related to this one particular conservation program. So starting out more generally, thinking in a conceptual way about the relationship between human and natural systems, you can think of economists as really focusing on this blue circle of economic behavior, right? And historically, we've built really sophisticated models of decision-making, often including the dynamics of the decision-making process, what individuals think about the future and how that impacts the decisions they make today. And in a natural resource context, we might connect that to a natural system, but historically, we've really simplified what that natural system looks like. And oftentimes that results in really missing out on what's actually driving the behavior. So if we oversimplify the natural system model, that influences the way that the incentives are shaped for the economic decision maker. In the groundwater context, if the kind of groundwater system is oversimplified, then maybe we don't really get the key drivers of the incentives that are altering groundwater use over time and space. And I think that the converse is also often been true, right? Natural system scientists, groundwater hydrologists have really complex models of groundwater systems, 3-dimensional models of groundwater flow that account for surface water linkages and recharge and so forth. But the economic component of those models is often very simple. Like the individual is going to extract groundwater at the same rate that they've been extracting water into the future, and we'll just assume that and pop that into the model and see what happens. But again, you miss that important feedback that is really key to understanding how conservation policies that are going to protect these resources may influence the long-run changes in the system. And so in economics, I would hope that we're doing a better job at connecting with natural scientists, with hydrologists, with engineers, with biological scientists to integrate in a real way the natural system into the types of economic decision-making models that we're evaluating. And then ultimately, we're then better able to address some of the questions about what are the value associated with those systems. So we can think about measuring those values in a couple of ways. We can think about the value of natural capital in the groundwater context. What is the value of the stock of water that lies under the ground? Or we can think of the flow of ecosystem services that derive from that stock, right? We could measure the benefits that individuals derive from extracting and applying groundwater to crops, or the ecosystem flows that are supported by the groundwater stock. And economists have thought of various ways, and in the environmental context, I think quite creative ways of thinking about how we value these resources that aren't directly traded in markets, either as a natural capital stock or as a flow of ecosystem services. And ultimately, that's important when we want to evaluate policy, where the policy is going to affect behavior, the behavior is going to affect the natural system, but then how do we value that change in that overall human natural system? And what does that mean about the types of policies that we put in place and how we evaluate those policies? So I'll try to take kind of this conceptual model and apply it to a specific case study. And in terms of groundwater terminology, I want to talk about two things. The first is saturated thickness. So in a groundwater context, the saturated thickness is just the vertical distance underneath the ground that's permeated by water. And over time, as pumping exceeds recharge, that saturated thickness can decline. And a related concept is this notion of well capacity. Essentially, what is the flow rate of a given well? How quickly can it extract groundwater out of the ground? And that's going to be a function of saturated thickness. All right, so we're measuring capacity in gallons per minute. As the saturated thickness of the aquifer declines, that means that the ability of the individual well owner to pump water out of the ground also declines. The number of gallons per minute that they can pump declines over time. And in our conversations with producers, that's the most salient way that they interact with the stock of the resource under the ground, right? They see changes in their well capacity over time, and that affects how well they can keep up with drought conditions, whether they can get water on the crops at a sufficient rate to keep them irrigated and ultimately yielding, high yielding so that they're profitable. So as their well capacity declines, their profitability declines. They often switch away from irrigated crops to more dryland crops, which are also less profitable. So I'm going to use this concept of well capacity a fair bit in describing the conservation program. And that conservation program is within the Ogallala Aquifer, which I have here. The Ogallala is the largest aquifer in the United States, one of the largest in the world, and underlies parts of 8 separate states. From this figure, you can see that the saturated thickness varies quite significantly throughout the aquifer. So there are parts of Nebraska that have literally hundreds of feet of saturated thickness. And as you move kind of south and west in the aquifer, there are parts of the aquifer that have less than 50 feet of saturated thickness. And importantly, those levels are changing over time, right? But in general, the north and eastern portions of the aquifer have a lot of water, and the southern and western parts of the aquifer have not as much water and a lot faster declines in the water that's available. So here's a Google Earth image of the study area that I'll be talking about in southwest Kansas along the Arkansas River. I could have taken this picture outside of the airplane as I flew over yesterday morning, but I was in an aisle seat and it was kind of awkward to get my phone out. So I relied on Google Earth, but it gives you a sense for the intensity of the irrigation that's going on here, right? So you see a bunch of circles. Each of those circles is irrigating a quarter section of land, which is approximately 130 acres. In the middle of each of those circles sits the center pivot system, which is fed by an irrigation well. Okay, so each of those circles has a straw in the ground, and there are a lot of those straws that are pumping water at the same time. Okay, another thing to note is that there's differences there, right? Everybody isn't doing exactly the same thing. There are differences in the crops that are planted, and if we were to see the water use, there's also going to be variation in the amount of water that's applied to those crops as well. So what's driving that behavior, right? That's an economic decision that we want to be thinking about. Now, over time, you can imagine with that intensity of irrigation, the level of saturated thickness in this area is declining, okay? And as producers are aware of that and policymakers, there's been a lot of interest in thinking about, okay, how can we conserve the saturated thickness? How can we conserve our capacity to maintain the viability of the irrigation wells, but also to maintain the viability of the community? So one program that was initiated in 2008 in this area is the Upper Arkansas River Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program. Okay, this is a state and federal partnership, and it's not just in Kansas. This particular program is focused on Kansas, but there are CREP programs that focus on groundwater retirement in several different states. And the idea is that you're gonna pay individual well owners to take those wells out of production permanently, okay? On average, the incentive payments are about $170 per acre. And if you do the math, $170 times 130 acres, so it's $170 per acre, 130 acres. Contracts are typically 15 years. That's a lot of money, right? It's between $300,000 and $400,000 that an individual well owner is getting paid to take their well out of production. Okay, so during the contract period, they can't plant any crops. After the contract period is over, they can dryland farm, but they cannot plant irrigated crops. They can't irrigate that land again. And in order to be eligible for the program, the individual has had to have used the well sufficiently in the prior 5 years. So there's some minimum threshold that you have to meet. And the intention there is they don't want to just enroll wells that weren't going to be used anyway, right? They want to use wells that actually were pumping a fair bit of water. Importantly, you can't reallocate water from like a well that you retire to another well that you have that you own. And it's also true that in this area they're not allowing new wells in. All right, so that would also be not a very helpful part of the program if you could retire a well and then just drill a well somewhere else, right? So there's no new wells being allowed, and they're paying producers to take those wells out of production. The long-term objective here is to reduce aquifer depletion and to increase river flows in the Arkansas River. All right, so here's a map of the study region along with the 173 wells that are currently participating in the program. All right, so you can see that we have some red dots here of participants, but we also have a lot of gray dots that are wells that are not participating in the program. Again, you do the math on if it was whatever 300-something thousand per well, there's 173 of them. I think the program has committed about $45 million to taking irrigated land out of production, to taking those and retiring those wells permanently. All right, so the economic questions that we're interested in here related to this program are first, how does the program influence groundwater users? Who participates in the program? And how does participation affect non-participants, right? This is a common pool resource. So when one well goes out of production, it's likely going to have impacts on other nearby wells. So what are those impacts? And then if we have a handle on behavior, how can we value the kind of benefits generated for that program? Right, it costs in the neighborhood of $45 million. What are we getting for the $45 million in terms of benefits? I'm going to look at estimating those benefits in two ways. The first is I'm going to use some stated preference survey results, and I'm going to attach that to a hydrologic model that illustrates the benefits associated with the program. That's kind of taking a natural capital approach. The second way is I'm going to use some integrated modeling to try to look at how retiring wells at those particular points has affected the profitability of nearby wells here.
Professor Suter, on the previous slide, are those wells connected hydrologic to the river?
Actually, most of them are not. So there's actually two separate aquifers that are part of this study region. The wells on the right are fairly hydrologically connected to the river. The wells on the left are less connected to the river. They're part of the Ogallala, which is deeper and not directly connected to the Arkansas. So to the first behavioral question of who participates, this is building off some research that I did with a master's student at CSU that looked at a similar CREP program that paid producers to retire land in Colorado. And there we found that most of the participants had relatively low saturated thickness and poor soil quality. not too surprising, right? They had low opportunity costs, so they enrolled their wells into the program. Now, in Colorado, or in Kansas, we actually don't see that. So if we look at kind of the period before the program was initiated, the wells that actually retired tended to have higher saturated thickness than the average well and used more water, in the neighborhood of 200 acre-feet of water per year, which is slightly more than the typical well in the study region. Okay, so 200 acre-feet of water is a lot, right? Think of a 200 football field with 200 feet of water on the top. That's how much a typical well is using per year. So just some summary statistics to suggest that the program is actually doing a pretty good job of enrolling wells that would have used a fair amount of groundwater had they not been retired, which is a good thing. We also look to see if there are any strategic behavior on the part of those well owners. Did they pump more in the prior 5 years just to be eligible for the program? Remember, I talked about that eligibility requirement. Or maybe they pumped a lot more just to get the benefits, all the benefits they could, and then they retired their well, right? So they kind of strategically did some over pumping prior to enrolling. And we actually don't find any evidence of that either. So both kind of good news for the program that it's actually doing something, that it's actually reducing water use. But then we want to also ask this question of how does the behavior of the individuals that participate affect the behavior of folks that don't participate in the program and continue to pump groundwater? And we can see this effect going in a couple of different ways, right? So the most obvious way is that if you have a well that stops pumping groundwater, they leave more water in the ground. Some of that water moves laterally to the wells that are not participating in the program, continuing to pump. And because they have more water than they otherwise would have, they pump more water, right? So that's going to tend to diminish the efficacy of the conservation program because people are just pumping that water anyway. On the other side, we have the fact that, as I mentioned before, this is a common pool resource. There's some competition for this water, right? So if I decide to cut back a little bit on my pumping today, somebody else is going to benefit from that individual conservation. They're just going to pump it out of the ground tomorrow. But if you take wells out of production, that's like you're taking competitors away, right? There are fewer straws in the ground to take up my water. So now if I conserve a little bit of water today, I have more water for myself that I can pump in the future. That may increase the efficacy of the conservation policy just by reducing the competition for the resource. So we're going to try to evaluate this kind of empirical question using well level groundwater use data from the state of Kansas. And when we do that, this is kind of the empirical strategy that we have. So imagine, this is again this picture that I almost took out the plane window of a well with a 2-mile radius around it. And the question is, if say 3 of their neighbors participate in the program, what effect does that have on the pumping that's at the well in the center of the circle? Does it tend to increase or decrease their water use? And how does that change over time? Okay, so yes.
And these are neighbors, and so one well owner is not controlling 2 nearby wells, right?
That's right. So it is possible that some of these wells are owned by the same person, but we take out, for example, we take out all the wells that are owned by somebody who participates in the program. They might be different for a variety of reasons, so we don't want to really mess with them. Our results are actually robust in including them, but for our general analysis, we leave them out. Okay, so our results suggest that indeed, yes, the people that don't participate are affected by the people that participate in the program. And in fact, they use less water as a result of other people participating in the program. That reduced competition actually reduces groundwater use in the short run, okay? And we can see kind of why that is. There tends to be less water intense crops planted near individuals that are participating, less corn and alfalfa than otherwise would have been planted. Over time, however, we see those initial reductions dissipate. Okay, so as that water starts to filter and increase the saturated thickness at the wells nearby, they tend to increase their water use. So here's kind of a time graph that shows, so if you think of time 0 is when your neighbor enrolls in the program, in the first few years, water use tends to be reduced by, say, 10 to 20 acre feet, 5 to 10%, a decent reduction in water use below what otherwise you would have expected. But then over time, water use increases. And if I were to able to go out even further, I would expect water to increase above the counterfactual because those wells have additional water available. So really what this program is doing is retiming water use, right? It's reducing water use in the short run to allow potentially for more water use in the future. Okay, so we can be pretty convinced that the program is actually reducing water use in the short run at least, leaving more natural capital in the ground, more stock of groundwater. But then the question is, what is the value of this water, right? Is the program delivering lots of economic benefits or not many economic benefits? How do we measure economic benefits, right? What are those benefits that we want to measure? Well, the most obvious one is what economists refer to as consumptive use value. If we have more water in the ground and that water is able to be used profitably, then that's a benefit. That would be thought of as a consumptive use benefit because we've taken the water out of the ground in order to generate the value. We could also think of other types of non-market values that are kind of non-use values. So the fact that there's more water in the ground may be seen as beneficial because individuals want to have more water to pass down to their kids and grandkids. In fact, when we ask survey questions about why do you value water conservation, that's the biggest one that it's much bigger than because it'll increase my profits. It's because I'll have more water to pass down to future generations. Also, the fact that there's values related to the community. The fact that, yeah, obviously I want to be more profitable, but I also want to live in a vibrant community. I want to have funding for schools and so forth. So having more groundwater means that maybe my community is more vibrant. Ecosystem values as well, to the extent that there are surface groundwater linkages, we get some benefits to those aquatic ecosystems. So we're going to try to value this set of values here, not just the consumptive use value. And we do that through a stated preference survey where we go out and ask people essentially what they're willing to pay for some of these, for additional groundwater. We did this survey throughout the Ogallala region in 6 states, sent surveys to approximately 8,000 producers. The contingent valuation question that we asked individuals was essentially, how much are you willing to pay? Are you willing to pay a charge of X per irrigation well? It would be charged to all producers that use groundwater for irrigation in your area. And that payment is going to fund an aquifer recharge project that's going to result in an average of Y gallons per minute in additional well capacity in your area. Okay, so then we can vary X and Y across the surveys that we send out. Individuals basically vote yes or no, do I support this or not? And by varying X and Y across individuals, we can kind of trace out a demand function for how much individuals are willing to pay for additional stock of water in the ground. Now, looking at some of these results, if we aggregate up to the county level, we see that overall willingness to pay for an additional 100 gallons per minute of well capacity, that's, for a typical well, maybe a 20% increase in their well capacity, which is not tiny. But on average, the willingness to pay is pretty low, right? Particularly for parts of Nebraska where I showed you earlier, they have a lot of saturated thickness. They aren't willing to pay much for additional water under the ground because they have a lot of water. As you move south in the aquifer and west, not only is there less groundwater availability, it's also getting hotter and drier. And in those areas, additional groundwater has a really high value. Another 100 gallons has a particularly high value. And so we do some work with this where we do climate projections and so forth. But what I want to talk about is then how do we use this to go ahead and value that conservation program that I talked about earlier. We're going to do that through 3 steps. So we're going to take these willingness to pay results. We're going to generate marginal willingness to pay functions for each of the 10 counties that are in this conservation, this CREP region that I talked about earlier in Kansas. And then we're going to link the wells that are participating with a mod flow model, with a physical model of the groundwater resource to try to predict, okay, if we retire a well at a given point, how much does it impact the amount of water available at wells nearby? And then we're going to actually calculate the benefit then for each of those wells as the area underneath the marginal willingness to pay function. I'll show you an example of this in a moment. All right, so if I show you what that marginal willingness to pay function looks like for one county in the study region, this is from Finney County, Kansas, I believe. And you see that it's downward sloping. Individuals that have relatively low well capacity have a higher marginal willingness to pay than individuals with a higher well capacity, as you would intuitively expect. And then we're going to map the participants to how it affects well capacity nearby. Right, so I think this is after 15 years. You can see the effects are pretty localized, right? Most of the benefits are going to go to the wells that are located near wells that are participating in the program. And I can show you another graphic of that. Basically, once you get beyond 10 miles, retiring a well doesn't have an effect on wells that are more than 10 miles away, at least after 15 years. And that actually doesn't change all that much as you go further out in time. So the benefits are going to be highly localized. And again, the way that we're going to estimate those benefits is we're going to look at the area underneath the marginal willingness to pay function from the capacity that they would have had without the program to where the capacity is with the program in place. Okay. The reason that we're aggregating underneath the demand curve instead of just multiplying, say, the marginal willingness to pay, the price times the quantity, is that would tend to overestimate the benefits, right? As they get more and more capacity, it gets less and less beneficial to them. And so a more accurate way to estimate the value is to look at the area, integrate the area underneath the demand function. We're going to do that for every well based on how much additional capacity it gets from the results that we see from that mod flow model that I showed you. When we do that, I apologize for the busy table here, but we can see that on average, the program increases saturated thickness by about 7 feet, which is not much, increases well capacity by about 23 gallons per minute, and that's generating about $4.5 million in value. Okay? So $4.5 million is certainly less than the $45 million that the program costs. And further, most of the value is going to wells that are located within 1 mile of wells that participate in the program. About 40% of the benefits are going to those wells that are located very close to participating wells. All right, so you know, I don't want this to sound depressing, like, oh, conservation will never pay for itself or something like that. Just that we do find relatively low benefits in terms of increased natural capital value based on the way that this particular program is structured. It's an expensive program, and it's at least based on these values that we're measuring. Now, admittedly, we're also not measuring values of people who are not, we sent a survey to groundwater irrigators. There may be some benefits, right? The community values, the ecosystem service values, and so forth that go to folks that are not, don't own agricultural land, and so we'd want to add those in as well, but those would have to be pretty significant for this particular program to pass a cost-benefit test. Now, I also quickly want to talk about some integrated modeling work that we're doing to value, instead of valuing the stock of water in the ground, here we're going to value how this program affects the flow of ecosystem services. Here, we're only going to be looking at the consumptive use value. So essentially, how do those wells that retire impact the profitability of the wells that continue to pump groundwater? Okay, and to do this, we built a framework that links economic decisions to agronomic production functions. Okay, so we need to know how does applying groundwater affect the yield of a particular crop and ultimately the profitability of those crops. We're going to do that for every well in the study area, and we're going to do that so that the production functions vary as a function of the crop grown, the type of soil, the well capacity at that well, as well as climate conditions at that well. And so the individual producer is then assumed to pick a crop mix that's going to maximize their expected profits given that weather is unknown, and then determine how much they irrigate that crop based on a particular climate realization. Okay, the cool thing is we can also change what those climate realizations look like into the future and so forth. Right, so it gives us an opportunity to kind of simulate the world into the future that links the agronomic realities to the decision-making of the producer, and then ultimately we want to then link that to the mod flow model as well. So we do that on an annual basis. Individuals make decisions about what they plant, how much water they use. That feeds into the hydrologic mod flow model so that we get some kind of drawdown in the aquifer that then changes the agronomic realities about how much they can, what their well capacity is in the next year, which influences their planting and groundwater use and so forth. And so we can play this forward every year into the future. And so just to give you a snapshot, and admittedly we're still working on some of these results. I didn't feel comfortable presenting the overall results, but to give you a sense for what this looks like, here's a similar graph where we look at, okay, here's the black wells are the ones that have participated in the program. How does it affect well capacity into the future for those nearby wells? But now we can actually see how does it affect the profitability, or at least the predicted profitability of those wells, both across space and time. Okay, so the red line is after 15 years of the program, and on the y-axis we have the increase in profit relative to what would have happened had the neighbors not participated in the conservation program. So, you know, after 15 years, nearly all the benefits are wells within 5 miles of those wells that participate. The folks that benefit from the program grow in space over time, and the benefits themselves grow as well. So that the blue line is after 50 years, what's the increase in profits for a given well that's located at a particular distance from a participating well. And now the next step is to kind of aggregate that. So we want to aggregate across both the number of wells that are located at these various distances, as well as across time periods, because this is actually just, this is an annual change in profit. We want to aggregate that flow of benefits across time, requires some discount rate and so forth. But that's kind of what we're working on now. But it gives you an example of a slightly different way to value the benefits associated with this particular conservation program. So just to summarize, you know, we do generally find pretty small economic benefits associated with this conservation program. As I said, there are some additional benefits that we didn't capture, but those benefits really have to be big in order for the program to kind of justify itself on cost-benefit grounds. And I don't necessarily know that the program has to justify itself on cost-benefit grounds, but particularly if you think, hey, we're spending $45 million, could we do better, right? Could we spend that money in a different way, have a different regime that incentivizes reductions in groundwater use, either at a lower cost or a higher benefit? And I think the answer is probably yes. With something like the evaluation models that I described, we can actually show how much more beneficial similar programs might be, or even rather than if we targeted some specific types of wells, could we increase the benefits? We have the same number of people enroll, but maybe different people enroll. What are the benefits associated with that? We can do some of that counterfactual analysis. Overall, I think that understanding these trade-offs in conservation policies really requires that we know how the policies affect behavior. And that's the behavior both of people who participate in the programs, but also the people that don't participate in the programs, particularly with a common pool resource like groundwater, where the effects of somebody doing something related, whether it's leaving more water in the ground or taking more water out of the ground, it's going to affect their neighbors. And that ultimately is going to determine the benefits that we derive from that conservation program. And I think it's important to link these changes if we really want to do an accurate job, a good job of estimating the values. We have to link the behavior to changes in the physical system to really understand what those benefits look like, who benefits, and how they benefit from the program. And admittedly, we still have a lot more work to do, right? We want to look at different types of programs, alternatives to this particular conservation program, and what you know, can we again do better, either in terms of benefits or costs. We also want to think carefully about some of the aspects of the model. I could talk for a long time just about the integrated model and all the components to it, all the assumptions that go into it. But one of the things that I think is quite interesting is thinking about climate, right? The individuals we assume are making a planting decision given some assumption about the distribution of climate outcomes that they might experience in a given year. But as climate is changing, how do individuals update their beliefs about the distribution of potential climate outcomes? Do they only look at the prior year? Do they look at the prior 5 years, the prior 10 years? If we want to integrate in models of climate change, right, we can predict at a pretty specific spatial scale what future climate might look like, but how decision makers interact with that changing climate is really important for models such as this. In addition, we just can't know ex ante what technology is going to be in 30, 40, 50 years, right? We don't know what prices are going to be or preferences. We can look at the sensitivity of our results to changes in those outcomes, but ultimately, you know, we're never going to have never going to have certainty about what the future looks like and some of the parameters of the model. And also, we need to do more that looks at you know, some of the questions that Garth asked about the connections between groundwater flows and surface water flows. Relatively modest in this area, but in other areas it's quite important. And some of the benefits are going to derive directly from, say, meeting institutional requirements, compact agreements associated with increasing river flows because of conservation. We want to better understand that. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. Lucy?
Sure. Can you go back to that picture you have with the like the red, blue?
This one?
Gradation, no, the willingness to pay. I noticed you, no, I'm sorry. It's like a map.
The 15 to 30 years.
Yeah, it was like, you had like 20 to 5,000 willingness to pay.
Yes.
Yeah. I think, like that's a pretty wide
Absolutely.
range.
Yeah.
And could you maybe, because there's a lot of students here, could you maybe like explain that a little bit? Because I think they probably care a lot that's maybe not a great thing to have.
Yeah.
A huge scale on that. So yeah, I just thought that.
So
This is an interesting example. That's all when you might have a range like that.
yeah, I mean, so this is like the median willingness to pay for 100 gallons per minute for a typical well in one of these counties. And I think that typically when you do a contingent valuation survey, it's pretty localized. And this is one that covers like 6 different states, and those states vary quite widely, even though they're all part of the Ogallala aquifer. That aquifer is very heterogeneous, very different in different locations, not just the groundwater resource itself, but then the characteristics above the ground as well. The climate, obviously in Texas is much different than the climate all the way up in parts of North Dakota, or South Dakota rather, which touch this aquifer. So, you know, we need to have the ability to have a wide variation in willingness to pay. It's one of the challenges of designing a survey question like that, where you really do need to have pretty wide variation in the survey questions that you ask that is able to capture that kind of upper end. Theoretically, yeah, we could predict willingness to pay, you know, of even higher amounts, but I believe that our survey only went up to 5,000. It may have gone up to 10,000. In any case, we don't want to extrapolate too far beyond what our survey questions ask, even if it fits the kind of model that we estimate. Go ahead.
So you mentioned that in 50 years, we gained 4.5 million with this program. Do you know what would be lost? Like obviously they'd be able to farm and
Yes.
gain income that way and things like that, but what would be lost if we let pumping continue this way?
Right. So what we can say is that the stock under the ground is $4.5 million more valuable than it will be if we don't have the program. And so the fact that the resource itself will be less valuable in the future is kind of built into that. But that's a really good question, a really hard question, right? Because that's in and of itself, that's an interesting thing that as we interact with producers, we want to be able to show them. And something that our integrated model can do quite well is to say, if you don't do anything, you just continue on the current trajectory, here's what happens to your production, your profits, and so forth, the aquifer itself. And indeed, people pump less in the future, right? But they pump less because the water is less available. They can't pump as much, and that's an important, that captures kind of the feedback between the economic and the physical model, that as water gets more scarce, people pump less of it. Now, you know, integrating the kind of climate change projections and so forth is another element that may alter what that trajectory looks like. But I think it's powerful to be able to show, and I don't have that here, and I apologize, but we can generate those results as well, kind of the do nothing, and then compare a different set of policies to what would happen if you do no policy.
So I had a question about this back to
Sure.
actually. You mentioned climate change between the difference, excuse me, between the northern and southern portions, and I'm wondering if you explored any other maybe more confounding variables.
What do you have in mind?
Ooh, well, do farmers in West Texas? I can't imagine why they would, but do farmers in West Texas make more net than those in Nebraska?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly possible, and we don't include like average farm income in the estimation process, but it is something that we could do. That'd be interesting to look at, because we could get data at the county level at least of like average typical farm income in each of those counties to see whether it explains variation in willingness to pay. It can be an interesting question.
I would have a similar question, but I was thinking there's another possibility, like the return for water, like how much the farmers invest in the water extraction, and the ratio with the margin they earn on the farm. Like when they extract like 1 liter of water with they have a certain amount of margin, something like that. I don't know, probably it's already turned for that, but I think that's
Higher value crops.
Yeah, and also possibly the geography, which will cause a difference, like different costs for extracting the.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and that is, we do incorporate that into our modeling. Is like, it's not just that capacity changes over time as saturated thickness declines, but it also requires more energy to get out of the ground, and that energy is costly. And so that also feeds into, as the water recedes, why our modeling predicts that you use less groundwater over time, because it's just getting more and more expensive to use. And that varies across the study area for sure, as does the land surface elevation, as you can imagine.
And like how much margin they have per liter of water.
You know, I would have to do some calculation to figure out. So a typical well, at least in the Kansas study region, we predict that it has kind of a net return. So kind of the revenue minus variable cost of about $40,000. That's for 130 acres. But to get right at your question, I'd have to do a little bit more in the way of calculations that is above my pay grade at the moment. So thanks. Yes.
So back on the slide where you talked about how non-participating wells decrease in
Yes.
their water use,
Yep.
increase over time. Do you predict that to go back up
Yes.
to their initial zero use?
Yeah.
And do you have any
Yeah.
maybe thought process about why that happened?
Well, so one of the drawbacks of using, in this case, observational data, the program was initiated in 2008, right? And we do have some wells that started participating right away, but we can't kind of project out more than about 8 years from that, because we just don't have the data yet. But I would expect to see, we were surprised actually to see that actually non-participating wells tend to reduce their water use below what they otherwise would have. But we kind of expect to see that this water use continues to increase because they have more water than they otherwise would have had without the program in place. So again, we're comparing it to a world where groundwater is declining over time. Now it's declining at not as fast a rate because those wells are out of production. So I have more water than I otherwise would, and I expect those wells to pump more, to use more water as a result. And indeed, I think that if you think about the program, it has to be designed that way, right? It's really retiming when the water is used. You use less water now, but you use more water at some point in the future. So I think, we've looked a little bit at trying to extrapolate some of these time dimensions out to see, like, when in the future does the program result in no additional water savings because all the savings have been used by neighbors and things like that. But it requires a little bit too much extrapolation for me to feel confident in. But really, yeah, what we're saying is water in the future is going to be more beneficial, likely, right? It's going to be scarcer in the future. Climate's potentially more severe, so that water may. So the program is providing benefits in that way, but it's an expensive way to provide those benefits, to fully retire wells, right? It might be that we could take that $45 million and pay more of a marginal incentive so that everybody reduces their water use by a little bit, right? We haven't run that simulation, but my guess is that would be, you get more benefits from doing something like that than completely shutting off a handful of wells at a very high cost than to get everybody to buy in and reduce their water use by a little bit.
Have you compared this with the rainfall patterns for those years? I'm wondering how much that accounts for some of the variation.
Yeah, so in this particular framework, we have kind of, in econometric, we have year fixed effects. So it's accounting for variation in rainfall. So that's kind of, so this is conditional on already having accounted for rainfall. So it shouldn't affect these results very much. But you're right, I mean, rainfall is going to affect both the amount of water that the individual uses, but also how much recharges into the aquifer, so how much is available in the next year, and can have an important role in, like, when we look at simulated water use under different climate realizations, the actual amount of precipitation has a huge impact on how much water gets pumped out of the aquifer in a given year. Yes?
What are the primary recipients?
That's a good question. Yeah, so I think there are two things. First is just the producers themselves, right? Because this is a problem that exists in many areas. The water retirement program is available in a relatively small geographic portion of the Ogallala, but producers throughout the Ogallala region understand that their water, that their saturated thickness is declining, their capacity is declining, and they want to do something about it. But they want to understand what the economic trade-offs of doing something about it are. And information like this, I think, is valuable for them as they try to go out and convince their neighbors that, hey, let's all get behind some type of conservation. So I've done more of that work in Colorado in talking to producers and showing them what the trade-offs are, right? Economics is all about trade-offs, and it is costly to engage in conservation, whether it's paying people to reduce their water use or putting in restrictions that say, you know, you can only use X amount of water per year. But then what are the benefits of that, and who gets those benefits? It can vary widely across space, and that's important to producers, the fairness aspects. And then just to finish your question, I think, you know, obviously there are groundwater managers, both at the state, federal, local levels that are interested to see these results. Now, would Kansas necessarily change their approach because of this? I don't necessarily know. This is a popular program. It's voluntary in nature. Nobody's told what to do. You're offered an incentive, right? So the program cost $45 million, but that's $45 million paid to individuals in this study area. So even if the benefits of the program are relatively low, they have been paid to participate, and so you know, so that it's still a popular program, even if it has relatively low benefits. So I'll just go here to Nika.
So I have three thoughts now related to the preceding questions, things that make sense. That early decline of neighboring wells to me makes sense in the context of common pool. Mm-hmm. Having observed irrigators out there in the field, one of the crucial decisions really is initiation. Mm-hmm. Irrigation management consists on when you turn the switch on.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of folks out there that see their neighbor starting to irrigate and
right.
Oh, he must know something
right.
else. I'm gonna go and switch it on myself. So in that context, having seen, oh, it's not on, I can see some
Right.
reduction just on that initiation effect.
Yeah.
The other thought is with respect to the map you showed earlier with respect to the values. The core measurement is well capacity, GPMs.
Yes.
And so the energy cost of pumping grows exponentially as well yield decreases. So it makes sense that places with lower saturated thickness, with lower well yields, will have a higher valuation for each additional GPM they can get from it.
Absolutely.
And then the third thought is, can you go back to the airplane picture that is related to that is related to the GPM? Once you get so constrained, either being from the weather conditions or your well conditions, GPMs is the amount, the yield, the well yield is very important, because you may have to decide to irrigate a semicircle.
Right. Right.
And you can kind of see that there.
Absolutely.
That part of the irrigation decision is how much of that field I'm going to save. It's not necessarily the cost of pumping, it's just how much water you can get. And so you end up deciding, I'm gonna, and so GPM has having that as your, the core of your analysis, it's kind of multifaceted on how it affect things on the field.
Yeah, I mean, our we've really evolved on that topic and found that the well capacity or well yield, as you say, is vitally important, both for the benefits that individuals get from the wells and how it affects their decision making, how they interact with groundwater stocks and so forth. So yeah, I mean, deciding how much of a field we like what the decision increments are is also something we've had to grapple with in the integrated model. Is it, a quarter circle? Do folks ever choose, a tenth of a circle or something? So anyway, that's a more minor point.
Time for one more question.
Yeah.
I was really interested in learning more about what do you think is key in developing an integrated.
Conversations, I think, dialogue with modelers. So the modeling work that we're doing fully integrates agronomists who are willing to stand behind the crop production functions that their models generate. We did some initial work in Colorado, and we tried to produce the agronomic production functions, and I'm not trained as an agronomist. I want somebody who's an agronomist to be able to say, yeah, those relationships make sense. And that makes sense that individuals might consider these trade-offs in the production decisions that they make. And then, obviously with the hydrologist, it's figuring out just a way to link the economic decisions of water use into that agronomic model, into that hydrologic model, which really came down more to a programming question than anything else. So having a good programmer who is also a good communicator, and that's what our postdoc Mani Rui-Rod has been done a great job at communicating with other disciplines and being able to integrate those models in a seamless way, because the models run quickly, even though they're solving for literally thousands of wells over multiple years. They can run pretty efficiently. So that's a programming challenge. But yeah. R actually.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, Jordan.
Thank you.
So this was great. It obviously generated a lot of discussion and questions. You may have more questions, but the good news is Jordan is our captive for a little while longer. We have a reception out in the hallway. There's I think your suite is being set up out there right now, or already is. So feel free to help yourself to some of that, and you can chat with Jordan a little bit further.
Thanks, Jeff.
That's good. We're getting into the hours of Python discussion.
Yeah, that's where we're starting up.
That was funny. We actually did in person in Colorado. So we used pins. Yeah, Tim Foster. So he's done that energy investment. So we did use that. Yeah. Yeah, it's like so in this particular project, the projects were collection who's at CSC. He's now at EE, obviously. But anyway, he's that
Actually, we just go put it out on the table there.
So I figured